Okay, we got Lily in charge of the microphone. We are trying out, well, we're using a sound system that the town recently acquired. We had some very a lot of complaints last time, including from me, that people simply couldn't hear what was being said. And so, are you hearing this? Is this okay? Because we can change the settings and so forth. So I have instructed these two lovely ladies here to pass this back and forth and use it. So we're hoping that tonight everybody, including old guys like me, are able to hear okay. Coming up next month, first Monday of December, we have our annual dinner, business meeting, and hopefully some entertainment. We haven't quite worked that out yet. We're waiting for somebody to say yes, and we'll see, but we're going to have some kind of entertainment. Since it is a dinner, we start at 6 o'clock and not 7 o'clock. So next December, first Monday, make sure you come in here at 6 o'clock. Bring a dish to share. Talk to your friends. We have a good time. We take care of some business. It can be an election if we have some people really eager to come in and do our work. And so let us know if that is the case. We'd like to know that. Coming up for the next year, we have quite a number of programs lined up, and quite a number of other ones that are not quite lined up yet, but we think we can get them. And I wrote them all down, and using my great ability, and I left it at home. And so I can't give you a chapter and verse on that stuff, but we do have quite a number of different, a variety of programs coming up for you for next year. And I think maybe very soon I'll be able to give you a complete listing of that. So get ready for a great year. Remember that when we get into January, February, March, we get on winter schedule, and we don't meet in the evening, but we do meet on Saturday at 1 o'clock. And so make sure you can do that. So there's a lot of good things coming up. And we're glad to see the big, nice crowd here. This is great. We have, I think, some very interesting stories. I asked Lily how I should advertise this and how I should entitle it. And she says, Another Immigrant Tale. And we have two people here who actually gave us their birthdays, so we can know how old they are.
After a while, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Since they already put this out there, it was 1941. And as I think all of you realize, 1941 in December, the day that will live in infamy, was the date that we got into World War II. But other European countries were having a go at it before that. And so we have here two people who were born in Latvia, which is a little bit north of Poland. By that time, it had become a battle zone. It was really very, very tough times. And eventually, as the war went on, then you had to flee from the communists, and you eventually ended up in a displaced persons camp. Is that the way to say that? And eventually making their way here to this country in 1949. Did I get that right? There's got to be a story here, folks. There's got to be a good story. And so here they are, Lily and Ingrid, Another Immigrant Tale, growing up in Latvia during very, very difficult times.
The reason it's Another Immigrant Tale is because Peter Zarn, sitting back there, has already given his story, and he was luckily a little bit older and could remember more than we did. I'm not going to give a history of Latvia. It is south of Lithuania and south of Finland and north of Poland and Lithuania. So it's on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. It's a very small country. maybe the size of the two Virginias put together, something like that. It, however, is a harbor that does not freeze, and it is a sea route into Central Europe for trade, all the way from the 12th century on up. So everybody ran all over it, just like Belgium, and there were centuries and centuries when other people basically held the Latvian population as serfs or their military soldiers. So there's been a lot of toil, a lot of toil and hardship. On the back wall, there is are 3 panels which will give the whole history from prehistoric times till 2006 when Latvia became part of NATO. So there's the whole history of Latvia in 3 little panels. So I won't go into that. I mean, you can ask me questions about the whole big messy part of the occupation for centuries is in that middle panel. And for a good chunk of time, from the 12th century until 1918, most of the land was held by German-born landholders. They had been there for decades already, but the Latvians basically were serfs up until certain parts of the country got free. But we don't go into that. What we're going to go into is our family's history, and basically we're going to start with the late 19th century and my father's parents. This is Edward Bergs and Anna Scudder. And grandfather was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon who studied in Latvia and in Estonia under the Germans. He was the son of a well-to-do farmer. And the reason we have a German name, not a Latvian name, is because Latvians didn't really have last names, the same way as Scandinavians didn't have last names for a long time. So the Germans decided we should all become Christians and we should all have last names like they do. So they gave you a name that had something to do with you, and his family happened to live on a hill, so Berg means hill in German. But if you run across the Germans with an S on the end of their name, that's Latvian. So anyway, and she came from a family, her father was an organist and a school teacher in a small town, and the building is still there. Ingrad's visited it. So. Okay. Our grandmother's family came from the city of Riga, and our grandmother Elizabeth, when she was done with her middle school, like high school, she became a nanny and a teacher of the German language in Russia. The Russians were starting to get wealthier, and they wanted to have education like the rest of Europe, and they would import nannies that could teach their kids German. This was from 1907 on. Then she married a Latvian banker, and they lived in St. Petersburg. They had a pretty good life until the Russian Revolution came, and they lost everything. They actually had to flee for their lives. My mother was born in St. Petersburg, and when people ask on any kind of application, where were you born? She says, St. Petersburg. They say, oh, you're Russian. She says, no, I'm not. But by the time she was 5, they had to flee because the conditions in Russia were so bad. The Germans actually had a blockade on St. Petersburg, and the city pretty much was starving. My grandparents' family really never recovered after the Russian Revolution. First World War hit, and then the Depression, and the Second World War. And even though they were always able to be fine, they were not like economically above water anymore than they would have liked. And then when World War II came, my mother's family broke up. My father actually was taken to Russia during World War I by his father. He had 2 brothers, and the father took the whole family to Russia to get away from the fighting in World War I. And when Latvia became an independent republic in 1918, they came back to Latvia, and he set up his practice. He was an ENT surgeon, in the capital city of Riga. He had a practice for a few years after he came back, and he was doing very well. And then he died of blood poisoning. We don't really know how he got it. So he left his wife with 3 young sons, which she managed to put through university. 2 of them also became surgeons. Our parents grew up in the same apartment block, or same apartment building actually, in Riga. And it was a building with multi-stories, I think, what, 5 or 6? And there's a central courtyard, and their apartments were across the courtyard. So Dad noticed this girl who was, what, about 6, what is she, 6 or 7 years younger. But so he kind of watched her grow up, and when they started courting, they would blow spitballs from a straw across the courtyard and send messages to each other. And my mother said her younger sister was forever looking out the window, and she kept pushing her down. But anyway, so they kind of grew up in the same building, and they married in 1934 at her parents' house. Dad did not want to compete with his older brother, who was also an ear, nose, and throat surgeon in Riga. So Dad moved to Liepāja, which is a huge city, the 2nd largest city in Latvia on the coast of the Baltic. And he set up his ENT practice there. Well, we arrived in 1941 in an unheated hospital at the start of World War II. The doctor was this is before sonograms, so the doctor was very surprised that there were 2, because my father said to him, my father had been listening with his stethoscope, and my father said to the obstetrician, he said, I think that there are 2 in there. I'm hearing 2 heartbeats. And the doctor said, oh, no, so, but anyway, we were born 40 minutes apart, which I guess is a little bit long for twins, anyway. We're always too serious, as you can see, even when we're babies. This next one shows you how serious we get. We're still serious. I think also, most of the studio photos we have of us when we were young, we look like we don't like the photographers. I don't know why. This is the house we lived in Liepāja. It has now been made into an upscale hotel. We did visit about 3 or 4 years ago. It's very interesting. In a city that's mostly made up of a lot of wooden houses, it's one of the few really nice brick ones. This is the place where we got our first spanking, after we ripped up some medical books that had been left within reach of our playpen. Why did we leave Latvia? The Russian Bolsheviks had invaded Latvia in 1940 and deported more than 30,000 people to Siberia, people that did not agree with them. And then the Nazis came and drove them out in 1941. When the Soviets invaded again in 1944, everyone who was not a peasant or a communist knew what their fate would be, and they had to leave if they could. We were already on the coast, so we got on a boat for Germany. We left in a big hurry and could bring very little with us. A patient buried father's beloved Artie motorcycle so the Russians wouldn't get it. The family had hoped to return soon. We do have some photos we carried with us, as well as a silver sugar bowl and some spoons. Later, after we were able to visit Latvia, relatives did give us some other family mementos that they had saved for us. The only thing Lily and I carried with us was a teddy bear that we had been given on our first birthday, and we still have those teddy bears. One of them is over there. We left by German troop ship from Latvia. From northeast Germany, we made our way south and west. At one point, we lived in a small town in Saxony called Herrnhut. We had a distant relative there who was of the Brethren religion, It is sort of like Moravians, if any of you are familiar with that. There was a huge settlement of them around Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and all the world archives of this religious sect are kept down in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. This group also sent missionaries to South America, Tobago, and Labrador. They had a long history of helping other people. And this distant cousin of ours was called Elizabeth, and it seemed like her house could hold endless amounts of refugees, and they called it Elizabeth's stretching rubber house. We also lived on a Bavarian farm. Our father was working in a medical office at that time in Dresden, Germany. By luck, he was home with a cold the day that they bombed Dresden. His building did not survive the firestorm. For a while, we kept moving from Dresden. We kept moving south and west to try to get away from the fighting. It was obviously in wartime, you really don't have very good, news. It's not like Twitter and Facebook or anything today. It would have been nice if we'd all had cell phones, but you tried to figure out what's going on and you tried to get away from it. We did leave the Dresden area right after the bombing. We do remember a lot of things burning, but we never saw anything, as kids, we never saw anything, really dreadful. I have Lithuanian friends who did, but we're very lucky. We did not see any tragedies, ourselves as kids. Eventually, in '45, the Allies set up more than 100 camps for what they classified as displaced persons. We were not refugees, we were not prisoners of war, we were just displaced, along with, millions of other people from Eastern Europe, displaced by Germans and displaced by the Russians. And by '45, there were 1 million people left like that in Germany. And you really couldn't handle it. Germany was in bad straits itself. So they needed to do something also to prevent, health epidemics and, what are you going to do with them? These people have to be sheltered and fed someplace instead of milling around this country that's in bad straits itself. 170,000 of this 1 million people were Latvians. I'm sorry, we're from the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We ended up in one of the camps, and Father, in fact, worked in more than one camp as a physician. You can see 2 different places here. On the top photo, he's wearing a black uniform because the Allied military had set up a civilian work corps, and they dyed U.S. Army uniforms black and gave them their own insignia. It was like a work corps, and whatever you were good at, an engineer or doctor or whatever. I mean, obviously lawyers couldn't work, but they tried to put people to work so they wouldn't be sitting around idle. We were in about 4 camps, including the last one where we left for the United States. This is the Babenhausen DP camp in 1946. My younger sister was born there. She slept in like an orange crate for a crib. We were frequently moved to other camps depending on whether they needed to consolidate facilities, or sometimes we moved to another camp where there were more Latvians, because there were multiple nationalities in each of these camps. This is the Streitberg DP camp. We were also there in 1946. We turned 5, and we were no longer eligible for powdered milk. My father had found that his older brother, his middle brother, had escaped to Sweden in a longboat, and he was a refugee in Sweden, but they were doing better up there. And so he ended up writing to him, and his brothers sent care packages that the Swedish government provided for people like him to send to relatives. when we turned 5, Dad wrote, we have all these letters Dad wrote to my uncle. We don't have the return letters. But Dad wrote and said, don't send candy for the kids anymore. He used to send candy and clothes and shoes. But he said, don't send candy anymore. The kids no longer are eligible to get powdered milk, so send powdered milk. So that gives you a little bit of a glimpse of things. The little boy on the right is my father's cousin's son, eldest son. He was about 2 there. Unfortunately, he caught bone TB from a soldier that they were living in. Well, we all lived in really tight quarters with other people. Sometimes, you were living in a room divided up by ropes and blankets for privacy. And sometimes you had your own room, depending on what kind of a facility it was. But they lived with a soldier who turned out to have TB, so the kid caught TB from him. As a result, he had a leg that was, about this much shorter all his life. He still does. He turned out fine, went to college here, and turned out to be, for a while there, a salmon fisherman in Alaska, so he was doing just fine. But it meant they had to delay their entry into the United States because the United States would not let him in because he was obviously contagious, or they wanted to make sure he was no longer contagious. So they had to wait in Germany for, another 3 years or something like that. My grandmother felt she could not leave my aunt, who had just graduated high school in Latvia during the war. So she decided she would emigrate with my aunt. My grandfather said he could not leave Latvia because the boss at his bank had given him the keys to the bank and had given him the responsibility for the bank. So he felt he could not leave. And he basically said to his wife, well, you'll be back in 3 months. Unfortunately, they never saw each other again. We did get, contact with them eventually during Soviet times. We got a lot of letters, most of which were censored. You had holes cut out of them. We can't figure out what could possibly be in there that, would be so important that somebody had to sit there and cut holes in your letters. And some letters we wrote them, we could tell that they never got. We have no idea. Did I cover all of them? Okay. And that's my grandma in the picture in back of one of us there, sitting there. My aunt's not in this picture. That's Mom and Dad and the 3 of us and Grandma. This next picture is all of us after about 4 years. We got really good food in the DP camps, but there wasn't a lot of it. It's sort of like what you would get from the food bank here. Basic staples, bread and cheese. What was that? There was something that everybody was really sick of. It was called the Green Miracle. And that was pea soup. We had lots and lots of pea soup in DP camps. I've forgotten that. They called it the Green Miracle. Okay. I don't know, maybe my mother didn't give me that. I don't remember. Well, peas, like beans, have a lot of protein in them. So. But as you can see, we're all looking kind of worn out and kind of skinny and not too healthy. We may have been scared of the officials too. I don't know. Yeah. And these are official immigration photos. They're sort of like passport photos, but this is like probably a full year before we were allowed to come. You had a long time while you applied and you were being processed, and they would figure out where you would go. Life in the camps was really very interesting for kids. Kids really didn't feel the lack of their former lives like the parents did. These pictures of us in 3rd grade, practicing piano scales on a plywood keyboard. We still had it when we came to America. I wish I had it now. We must have discarded it somewhere. but all the keys were painted on there. You had to practice until you get your hands on the actual piano maybe once a week or once a month or something. The camps in the American zone were good. Mom joined a choral group in the Babenhausen camp, and they traveled to other camps like Fischbach for Latvian song festivals, like in 1948. There were really two agencies that worked with refugees. One was this UNRWA, the UNRRA, which is United Nations Refugee Resettlement Association, and the other one was IRO, which was International Refugee Organization. Yes. The adult population in the camps of refugees from the Baltics was well educated. Artists, teachers, musicians, politicians, and they used all their talents for entertainment, education, and recreation. There were classes of all kinds: language classes, art classes, craft classes. They published books, produced articles to sell, and put on plays. Next picture. The twins learned Latvian folk dancing and how to garden in a Latvian version of 4-H. We really have no clear memories of bombings or trauma. We were too young and probably too clueless. But I think there were some subconscious things that got left behind. When we were at Syracuse University, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And all of the bases around Syracuse went on maneuvers, and there were constantly airplanes flying over the city, practicing whatever they were practicing. And both of us got really anxious, and we finally figured out that it was something that reminded us of wartime and listening to airplanes. But aside from that, really, we don't remember anything really awful. The refugees in Europe were remembered by folks in America very nicely. I remember being taken to a room where there was a huge pile of saddle shoes in the middle of the floor. We were told to go and pick out a pair. I also remember care packages, such as the ones we now put together in our churches for Hurricane Katrina or New York City right now. They were full of things like pads of paper, pencils, hygiene items. For kids, there were always toys. Likely the ones that were made for kids were put together by school kids in America. Maybe some of you here remember putting together care packages for other kids during the war. Were you ready?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
We learned a lot. The washcloths and the toothbrushes were good, but we loved the jacks and the paddle balls that were stuck. There were these little rectangular Red Cross boxes. Yeah. So thank you very much. Appreciated. They were used. So on the way to America, we were on a U.S. troop ship, the General House. We saw the White Cliffs of Dover passing through there. After that, we had very many days of very stormy weather. No one stayed in the mess when there was food. The tables had edges on them like this and great big heavy mugs. And when the ship was tilting, all the mugs would slide down to one end of the table and down the other, and nobody had any appetite to eat anything. So they would stuff the kids' pockets full of apples and hard-boiled eggs and stuff like that. And then everybody would try to eat what they could on deck where there was some fresh air. The dads were housed in the bow and the stern, and they put the moms and the kids in the middle of the ship as there was less motion there. The mothers got too seasick usually and stayed in bed. The children did really well after a while and had the run of the ship. In fact, we're kind of surprised probably how much freedom we had on that ship. We found all kinds of nooks and crannies, and we discovered that if it went way down in the bowels of the ship where the mess was, that the stewards kind of liked sneaking you things. So we always went down there in the afternoons, and they gave us these slabs of 3-color ice cream that are wrapped up in paper. You probably remember that kind of ice cream. They came in a big box or something, but we always snuck down there and they would come out and just give us all kinds of goodies. So when we arrived at night in New York Harbor, and we couldn't see much because it was dark, and we couldn't figure out what was going on because there were these lights just going from one side to the other. We had no idea what it was. Well, I don't know now whether it's West Side Highway or the BQE. But the point is there were cars, just lines and lines of cars like you would see today. But we couldn't figure out what it was. We'd never seen anything like it because, of course, you don't have that kind of traffic in Germany, especially, who had cars. In the morning, we saw the Statue of Liberty. And we debarked on a wharf in New York Harbor because Ellis Island was no longer being used for immigrants. It was being used for detainees, prisoners of war, that sort of thing. It was still in use. It hadn't become a park yet. But they didn't use them for processing immigrants. We got on a bus we had a really neat thing. We were sitting on our luggage, what little we had. We had several wooden boxes that Dad had made in camp with what little stuff we had. And I don't know if we had any satchels or anything. Obviously, we were clutching our teddy bears. So we're sitting on our luggage waiting to get processed for somebody to tell us where we went next. And this woman walked up to my mother, an American woman, and she reached out and wanted to shake my mother's hand. And she said, "Good luck to you," and just walked off. And my mother realized when she walked off that she had left something in her hand, and she had given her a $5 bill, which was really nice. My mother never forgot that. By evening, we were on a bus to Clark's Corners, Connecticut, which is somewhere near Willimantic, Manchester area, to the house of the person who sponsored us. You had to have a sponsor. That meant that person would be responsible so you would not become a burden on the state. This person was a Latvian who had come in 1905. A number of Latvians had come in because of political turmoil in Latvia in 2005, and a lot of people stayed here. In fact, we've got a number of people here, some in Tully who are from the 1905 Latvians. They no longer speak Latvian, and they consider themselves purely Americans. They do remember where their ancestors came from, but this person sponsored over 200 people. In fact, unfortunately, we don't even know his name because we were only at his house overnight. We arrived like about midnight, and it was foggy. We slept there, and the next morning he took us to Hartford, where a refugee organization put us up in an apartment in the inner city in Hartford, where there's now a traffic interchange right in the middle of Hartford. The building doesn't exist anymore. Once we joined a Lutheran congregation, we stayed with a private family for a while. But since my grandmother was with us also, we were too many people. We were kept back from school about half a year, but we learned English in 6 months from classes in a BOCES office. After a while, it was kind of boring. We ended up just putting together picture puzzles of the United States, that sort of thing. And we learned English from the kids on the street pretty rapidly. Father was working as an orderly at a crippled children's home, and Mom cleaned Aetna and other insurance company offices downtown at night. Okay. We had some benefactors. The Lutheran Church, in fact, organized, and various other churches in Hartford organized Sunday afternoon get-togethers where people could meet refugees and bring them donated goods like pots and pans, things like that. We still have, I believe, one kettle. Do we still have one kettle that was donated to us? However, one of these get-togethers, this man walked up to our family and just got to talking, and we got to be friends with them. They were Quakers, Libby and Paul Butterworth. he was a trustee of Hartford Hospital, and they just took an interest in us. One time he would show up and he'd say, "Can I take the twins for a ride?" And he'd come back, we'd have new shoes, that kind of thing. He was always arriving with bags of groceries. They also had us out to their house to play with their grandchildren, things like that. He got my father a job in the Hartford Hospital in the pathology department, which was a little bit more up his medical alley than an orderly in a crippled children's home. And he got my mother a job in the encephalography department, where they put the wires on your head to measure your brain rate. Anyway, that was kind of interesting. Anyway, we're still friends with his family, and we kind of remember, what they did for us. So Ingrid's been very involved over the years with the refugee program in Syracuse, and we feel like we want to pass it on, so that's kind of nice in their memory. They both passed on, but their children are still alive. What did I miss here? Oh, we also got sent to a fresh air camp in the summer by the Hartford Current newspaper. They were in a welfare camp for inner city kids. So that was very nice to get out of the city. Learned to swim there too. Grandmother took care of Sylvia, shown here at age 5 in Capitol Park in Hartford. Grandma learned English by listening to the radio, and she was listening to a presidential election, or what was it? I think it was Eisenhower getting elected, or something, anyway. And reading magazines, and you could see she's sitting next to a Life magazine cover there on the bench. Adults also went to English classes in the displaced persons camp to try to learn English. And I believe our parents did go to some English classes when they were in the United States, evenings, the way they have English classes for non-speakers today. Economic conditions, of course, improved for us being in America. Unfortunately, we all gained weight. We eventually moved to a two-family house in a better neighborhood. My aunt, for a while, and her Latvian husband arrived from Germany, and a cousin was born, and they lived downstairs. We, of course, were out of place in the beginning, with our European-style long braids and hair ribbons, wearing long and warm stockings in the winter under our skirts. Of course, we begged to give all those things up. And then we laughed later when tights became fashionable when we were in college. Language things also came out funny sometimes. My dad was really puzzled when they asked him on a job application what he did for recreation. He thought, recreation? Why did they want to know about my sex life? And he did not put anything down for an answer. Ingrida's personal funny thing was that she got laughed at when she thought Venetian blinds were blind people from Venice. Lily thought that USA and America were two different countries. One strong memory for me is standing next to a woman in that Lutheran congregation, singing hymns along with her. Her finger ran along the lines, and she made sure to pronounce every word clearly for my benefit. It was a great way to learn English. I still love the old hymns as the music became very familiar from my childhood. The vocabulary in the old hymns maybe feel quite dated now, but the English language was so rich and visually descriptive in those hymns. Eventually, we moved to New York State because my father was recruited by other Latvian doctors to work at an institution called Wasake State School for the Developmentally Disabled. This was in Dutchess County, about 2 hours north of New York City. Foreign doctors could work as psychiatrists and basically like family doctors to the patients in these state facilities, while they studied for their New York State medical license exam. My mother worked in the dental office there, and we attended a rural two-room school in Dover Plains. It is hard living in two cultures, as you often have to choose where and how you spend your leisure time
and your resources. Since we lived so far from a bigger city where there might be more Latvians, we generally became more American than other Latvian kids. We joined 4-H, attended after-school clubs, attended American churches, and so on. We did go to a Latvian church camp several times, and we did visit with other Latvian families in New York City and Connecticut. Did I miss one?
Yeah, there you go.
My parents are the people in the front row here. My aunt is in the middle with the chiffon dress. As you can see, some people here have elbow-length white gloves. We are at a gala ball at the Waldorf Astoria, which is a far cry from Dover Plains, New York. But my father was a member of a Latvian fraternity, which is an academic organization in Latvia. But you basically stay in those fraternities all your life, and you make friends there, and you keep up, communication with them. In fact, in America, if you belong to that fraternity, you could just go to like Minneapolis and find out which fraternity members were there, and they would put you up, or they would help you out if you needed help. But anyway, this was a major anniversary of that fraternity, and lots of people from all over the United States flew in and had this ball at the Waldorf Astoria. It was quite something. My uncle ended up treating us to a hotel room there, as we lived 2 hours north, and we remember ordering ice cream from room service. But it was very, what they're doing here is a Polonaise. I don't know if you know what that is. It's like a big procession with music, and you're just walking in lines in front of other people. It's like getting to know people at the start of a dance.
Okay.
We became proud U.S. citizens 5 years after immigrating. My parents, of course, had to do a test, but we were underage, so at 15, we automatically became citizens. Latvians all over the world, however, continued to really be upset about the occupation of their native land, and especially about the destruction we heard of how the Russians were doing away with our history. They were telling lies about the history of Latvia, taking credit for a whole bunch of things. We're trying to destroy the culture and Russify the people, and they're also trying to discourage the language. In other words, Russian was the official language, and everybody had to speak Russian for business or school or whatever. The exiles very soon adapted to new countries, and since many of them were educated urban people with usually professions already, they found pretty good jobs and did very well. Sent their kids to school, but they also started up Saturday schools for their kids to keep teaching Latvian language. We never lived near one, so we never went to one. So I'm pretty poor. I can read, write Latvian, and I have to because of what I do now as a volunteer for Latvian causes. But my Latvian language is not the best, so I send my stuff by email to other people who are older than I and much better at it, and they correct my Latvian grammar. So, but I can communicate. We can go to Latvian. We can talk in Latvian. Move along. Latvian costumes persist as a reminder of the culture. The costumes that Latvians wore in this century basically come from the 19th century, 100 years ago. They're still worn on many special occasions. And my mother here is in a DP camp. She borrowed a costume from someone to sing in the song festival in '48. Singing and Latvian song festivals are a very long tradition in Latvia. They started in 1873, and they were a way to start building cultural identity and nationality long before we gained independence from Germany. During communist times also, it was a way to express your own culture without being overtly political. And sometimes they were using words on some of the songs composed for the song festivals that had hidden meanings, that were basically protests. Song festivals are still occurring in Latvia now, and they continued during Soviet times, but very much controlled. In the United States, they're held every 4 years, alternating every other year with Canada. The one that was held this July was held in Milwaukee. And we get about 5,000 people attending, most of whom have been practicing singing in their little groups, usually church choirs and sometimes just vocal choirs. And they practice the same songs. They know what they're going to be by the start of the year, and they practice them all year until July, and then they all meet in one place and sing together. There are also folk dance competitions for those. Okay. My mother sang, there was no choir. We were too far away from Poughkeepsie, where the closest Latvian church was. So there was no choir there, really, and we were too far to go. My mother never drove a car. So when they moved to Long Island, she joined the Latvian church choir there and purchased a costume to participate in festivals like this one that was held in Toronto. That's her in the lower picture in the costume, and the costume is hanging over there so you can see it up close. She purchased it new. We're not sure whether she got it directly from Latvia in the early 80s or whether it belonged to someone else and was never used. Is that it? Yeah. Syracuse had a lot of Latvians. At one point there were 2 church congregations. They're almost all Lutheran. 2 church congregations here. Right now there is still one. They only meet once a month though, in another church. A lot of the Latvians came here to Syracuse. They were recruited by the U.S. Air Force to teach Russian to airmen at Skytop at Syracuse University. One of my father's cousins came here that way, and also the other one. We had a lot of folk dance groups when I was in college here. We participated with an international festival that they had downtown at the Civic Center every year. We made thousands of baked goods and things to sell to people, and there were booths from all the countries, and it was very nice. We had a respectable weaver of Latvian outfits like that skirt on my mother's outfit. She lived in DeRuyter. She died about 8 or 9 years ago. But she was known all over the United States for her skill in weaving.
And her sister-in-law too.
Her sister-in-law in Syracuse did the embroidery like what you would see on top of that white blanket over the outfit. And her son did really nice woodworking. There's an example up there of his woodwork. Latvia under communism was really awful. There was about 50 years of the people being totally unable to express who they were. Our maternal grandfather and his oldest brother and family did not leave. The older brother's wife refused to go. She had one child with a cerebral palsy, and she just said, I can't, and they stayed there. They suffered economic and cultural oppression. All private land was taken and made into giant collective farms, which were very inefficient and ruined the land. All history was falsified in the school textbooks. Any kind of personal initiative you had on the part of the citizens was punished and discouraged. It made it very hard for them when Soviets finally left Latvia. It made it hard for them to be able to make any decisions on their own. For all but a few of the older generation, it is hard to venture an opinion about anything to anybody else, much less to make a decision about what to do with your life. With the young people now, it's a little better, and they are
doing things independently and working for their future. There was much chemical pollution in Latvia from industry and the Russian military, as it was a major port for the Russians. The Russians also encouraged immigration into Latvia so that more than 50% of the population at one time was not Latvian. Now with independence it's better, but a lot of the Russians did not want to leave because they too had been there for 50 years and they had kids there and property, and it was much better there than in Russia. They did not want to go back. A lot of them still do not want to talk Latvian or learn how to talk Latvian, even though that is the language of the country right now.
And it's required for citizenship if you
You want
have
to
to
vote.
pass a language test to become a citizen of Latvia.
Of course, there is little love on the part of Latvians for some Russians who remain in Latvia. Some intermarried with Russians.
Latvia regained its independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it became part of NATO in 2006. The Latvian organizations in the United States spent all those 50 years lobbying, trying to educate people about the evils of communism and to try to get NATO to pay attention to that block of Eastern Europe. And we feel much better about it, that there's some measure of security. It's not to say that the Russians couldn't come across the border again, and there's always a fear of that. But at least they're part of NATO and under NATO rules about defending member nations. We've been back several times to visit. We have very few relatives there. All three of our cousins have died. We do have some of their children and a widow there. We have several second cousins. The retired people are doing really badly because of the recession that's hit Europe. Latvia really bit the bullet and did a lot of cuts and economic measures to try to stave off a really deep recession, but a lot of people are hurting, especially people who are retired. They laid off a lot of teachers, stuff like that. But it's supposed to be kind of, somebody has labeled it the poster boy of the European recovery, but we'll see. Hard to tell. So despite 20 years of freedom, we feel it's going to take a few more generations to rid the country of mental baggage from 50 years of occupation. Democracy is definitely flourishing there. It's more like a British parliamentary system. It's kind of a complicated voting system, and they have too many parties. Sometimes they start out with 19 and end up at the election time by 9 or 10 or something like that. Is that right, Peter? I know, what was the last number?
It's been up to 14.
Up to 14, yeah, this time. But anyway, it's and there's coalitions, that kind of thing, when they don't get a majority. But it's an interesting system, but it is democracy. And economics are flourishing also, and people are going to school, and we have a number of people, in fact, Fulbright and Hoover scholars at Syracuse University right now who are coming over here on scholarships to try to learn more. So, for our part, we're very glad we grew up American because we weren't brainwashed. And got the feeling, though nobody actually ever said you can do what you want to do. I mean, our parents assumed we would go to college, and we did. But it was always understood that if you worked really hard, you could do things. And they never felt they could over there. So we're really, really glad that we grew up in kind of a psychological atmosphere that let you do, what you wanted to do, or at least could try to do it. So, and we don't understand why Americans don't vote in larger numbers. So please vote tomorrow.
some of this story might be interesting because you're listening to it from somebody who lived a little part of it. But each and every one of you has equally interesting stories in your family. It might be some generations back, but it's still fascinating, and it will be to your grandkids and great-grandkids. But if the things are only in the form of family stories that your grandma told you, please write them down. And don't throw out the old photos. Get them copied and give them to other people or the Historical Society. They are a fascinating part of the story of America. All the stuff on the table is Latvian things. They're known for their amber and silver jewelry and weaving. It was a country that was mostly pastoral. They have a lot of dairy with cows, and they raise sheep. So there's a lot of wool and weaving history and stuff like that. Amber is normally found on the beaches in Latvia. It's fossilized pine pitch that has fallen into the ocean and been fossilized over thousands of years. And it's found on the beaches, so that's what they use for their jewelry. So if you have questions, we'll be around.
Peter?
Could I make one comment?
Sure.
As some of you know, I was also born in Latvia and came to the States in 1950. One interesting commentary or comparison, your father buried a motorcycle
Yeah.
to keep it out of the Russian hands. My grandparents, in their home in the country, in the orchards, buried silver and gold, silver platters and gold beakers or whatever you have it, because they wanted to make sure that the Russians did not get it. And the assumption was, well, after a certain amount of time, you know, the
We'll
British
go
and
back.
the Americans will again create a democracy in Latvia so we can come back. Well, it's still out there someplace.
Somewhere. A lot of families like that, and some
The thing
people
that
have
makes it
told
kind
their
of safe, I
relatives.
understand that they built a new highway
Right
near the
over it.
back of my grandparents' orchard. So maybe it's been dug up and
Somebody found it.
re-bulldozed
Yeah. It was like a Viking hoard of jewelry, yeah. But
someplace in the
Yeah.
woods. There's jewelry.
some families have tried looking for it because when you were able to tell somebody, when you were able to go visit, maybe you went looking for it yourself, but they can't find it because the memory of exactly where in the orchard it was.
Which tree?
Yeah, which tree that's now cut down or falling, you know, kind of thing. So a lot of people buried whatever they could. Our relatives, for example, had Latvian flags and stuff in the boards behind the walls in their apartments. You were not allowed to have anything that was Latvian patriotic. So it wasn't until like the 1980s when Glasnost started, and the Russians really didn't know anymore whether they should clamp down on people, that people started pulling them out. But they hung on to stuff like that. It's just you didn't talk about it anywhere. You didn't talk about it in school, and you didn't talk about being Latvian on the street or anything. Basically, they were brainwashed. We weren't.
That's it?
That's
Anybody
it.
got questions?
Yeah.
Well, you did just fine. Thank you. That was excellent. We do have refreshments coming up over here, and be sure to look at the exhibits, ask your questions, and thanks again for just an excellent presentation.
It was fun. It was fun to do My mom died this year at the end of May, and if she had been here, she would have worn that costume. But none of us fit into it. She was taller and skinnier, and so otherwise one of us would have worn it. So we should have gotten dinosaurs. How old was she? She was 98 when she died. So, and she was remarkably strong. I mean, she had a few little things wrong with her, but you think living through a famine in Russia between the age of 1 and 5 that, you know, you would be frailer, but I don't know, some of the people who lived through those times, I don't know, they just were keepers. Pardon? We live on Bailey Road in Fabius. My sister Bob probably lived on
Isn't that funny? So that was, that's how. And then we got all the signs and all the stuff.
No, no, no.
We saw her running, but the crowd was so huge.
What a oh my God. We had a good day to get home. We came home from New Hampshire a day early because I thought, you know what, we're gonna get this land. Yeah, we were gonna come on Monday, but then decided, no, we better just try to mail it. Doing one shot. Oh. It's Lord.
That was, that was the rock. Then she left little beach. It's the crowd. Flowers. The other friends now. The Taraki fish to the food and
No. Hot dog. They couldn't stand it, huh? Oh my Lord, you were just going. John feel all right?
Yeah. Hey, girl.
All right. Hi, Sonny. I'm good. How are you? No. Are ya?
Yeah.